as has possibly been mentioned, I'm a professor of psychology, and my interests relate not only to psychology of stress and psychophysiological responses, but also to the psychology of medical reasoning and scientific reasoning and understanding evidence. And it's fair to say that the way in which evidence-based treatment in ME-CFS is regulated illustrates some of the problems we encounter when we are asked to interpret evidence, even if we are very well trained specialists and clinicians. And the particular example I'm going to be referring to, of course, is the example of the new NICE guidelines from the UK. Now, sometimes I need to mention this. I'm from Ireland, which is not in the UK. Um, but much of what happens in the UK affects us in Ireland, and of course other countries as well. The UK is often seen as a kind of leader in medical science in certain respects, and some of the regulations that NICE lay down are used around the world. So it is highly significant, therefore, when NICE decides to change its approach to a particular illness. Now, I'm going to talk about four different, I suppose, concepts. Um, the first, I'm going to go through the NICE review and the process that led to the new guidelines and what those new guidelines are. And most of my presentation will relate to this particular topic. So don't get tired ahead of time when you see the other sections appearing. I will briefly talk about maybe some of the theoretical underpinnings or the cultural stereotypes or those types of issues that have affected how NICE decided to formulate new guidelines. And specifically the issue that's quite a British thing, really, that the illness is perhaps psychologically driven rather than physical. The new NICE guidelines takes a completely different approach to things. I'll also then talk a bit more generally about how medical controversies happen and how difficult it can be to change people's minds. It is sometimes thought that all we need to do is present evidence for something and then everybody will believe us. But that is not how medical science works or any kind of science works, really. And it's worth, if you have any aspirations to change things, it's worth understanding a little bit of the psychology of how change gets resisted. And the challenge of change then leads us to some practical recommendations or some practical outlooks about how we might modernize this particular area. So let me not delay in getting into the critical details, I suppose, relating to the review and its implications. Sorry, for those of you who are not memorizing these things, the NICE stands for the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. And this is a national institute in the United Kingdom that sets treatment guidelines for use in the United Kingdom, and specifically in the UK's National Health Service. Now, there are some particulars there. The UK is a federated country, and there are bits of it like Scotland that have its own regulations and own systems. But generally speaking, that's what NICE is. The guidelines that NICE establish are not obligatory in the sense that all medical doctors are entitled to make their own independent decisions. But nonetheless, they are guidelines, they are recommendations, and they set an expectation for patients. The guidelines we're referring to were initially prepared. Let me go through the sequence for you. They're initially prepared as a result of a review process that commenced in 2017. Now, there were old guidelines from 2007, and those old guidelines essentially positioned ME, or what it called CFS, as a psychologically created condition. And therefore, the required treatments should be psychologically designed, and specifically things like cognitive behavior therapy. For a variety of reasons we don't need to go into, NICE commenced a new review of those guidelines in 2017. Now, it is incumbent on any agency like that to review things from time to time. So, whether or not it was controversial, it is wise to review the evidence for any treatment practice or any guideline, given that evidence is appearing all the time. So, the review group was populated by specialists. The chair and vice chair were medical consultants, very senior medical consultants in UK hospitals. The full review group then comprised a number of other people. There were 15 clinicians, 4 medical consultants, a professor of medicine, 2 senior academics, a social worker, a physiotherapist, an occupational therapist, a dietitian, a GP, a clinical service lead, and of course the vice chair and the chair. Now, the reason I mention that is because some of the discussion of the new guidelines appearing in the UK has appeared to imply that the review group was somehow taken over by patient representatives and was steered by lobbyists. There were 5 lay members representing patient organisations, but the other 15 were clinical experts in their field. Some of whom, of course, had a wobble towards the end and decided they didn't like the new guideline, but nonetheless, the vast majority of them signed up to, because it's a consensual document. The guideline was approved and has the imprimatur of all that clinical expertise. There was an extensive draft prepared, which took a number of years, published in November 2020. It was a 72-page document, and forgive me for going into detail, but I'll explain why in a moment, supported by a number of other documents. There were 10 evidence reviews. All of this was posted on the NICE website. It came to 2,733 pages. And the reason I mention this is because while this information was in the public domain for everybody to consult over and everybody to respond to, there were some media comments from certain quarters suggesting that the process was somehow secret and that nobody knew why the decisions were being taken. And indeed, there were some news reports in the British Medical Journal that quoted people saying as much. So that was quite at variance with the reality. Everybody in the world, I say all stakeholders, but essentially everybody in the world was invited to make a submission to comment on those guidelines. And 4,000 submissions were received. And that led to the proposed finalising date to be pushed back a little bit because there was so much to get through in terms of paperwork. But ultimately it was released, and the final pre-release version was circulated for fact checking prior to the scheduled release date. Now, this document then ultimately appeared on the 29th of October. This was the finalised version. There was a publication delay by a couple of weeks, a further delay, if you like, by a couple of weeks to allow an in-person meeting to take place with medical representatives and others to discuss the guidelines. And all reservations and considerations and questions were raised and through all those processes, and this ultimately was produced as the final guideline. And it made a lot of media attention because it fundamentally changed the way in which ME-CFS is discussed and is visualized and therefore treated as a matter of statutory regulation in the United Kingdom. Now, I say that the regulations are not binding in the sense of medical autonomy. Doctors have the autonomy to make their own decisions. But it is undoubtedly the case that when a national entity produces an official guideline, that creates an expectation. And if that expectation is ignored, then all kinds of legal liabilities arise for patients who are not satisfied with the quality of the care they are getting. So it's not a binding guideline, but it is as good as in any regulatory sense. What's new in the guideline? It's easier to refer to the highlight changes rather than go through every single thing in detail because it is an extensive guideline. Fundamentally, these types of things are new. There was a tightening up of how ME-CFS was to be diagnosed, And it requires, because there was inconsistencies and vagueness in the old guideline, um, 4 symptoms are required to be present: debilitating fatigability, unrefreshing sleep, cognitive difficulties, and post-exertional malaise. Now, orthostatic intolerance is not in there as a required symptom, but then, as was pointed out in the previous talk, a considerable percentage, 10 to 20% of patients don't have that. So if you made that a requirement for a diagnosis, then those patients would not receive a diagnosis. So orthostatic intolerance is included in the guideline as a description of a symptom that is very likely to arise, but it's not a requirement for a diagnosis. This is to ensure that everybody gets the diagnosis they need. Now, how this looks in the document, I'm going to show you a few clips like this, is simply in explanations like that. And later, when you see the video, you can do a screen grab and read the detail, or you can go to the website and find the detail. But all those symptoms are required to be present for a diagnosis. The following other symptoms may also be associated, and this is the secondary list. Orthostatic intolerance is obviously there right at the top. Other things then also appear, neuromuscular symptoms and sensory sensitivities and so on. And that is not to say that patients don't have these types of conditions very often. It's just to say that they are not required in every case for a diagnosis. So the 4 previous symptoms are required. These symptoms are very common but not required for a diagnosis. Now, the real, I suppose, attention gets focused on the management and treatment of ME-CFS. The focus of the new guideline is on symptom management. I suppose that is to distinguish from the old guideline, where the focus was on, cure, essentially, and attempting to remove the condition. The focus is on symptom management. It's on things like managing energy envelopes, rest, diet, and pain, and so forth. You are told in the guideline you have to give personalized advice to the person. You should advise them things like as follows: not to use more energy than they perceive they have, not to try to push through the symptoms. And that is a significant change in the guideline, because, as you probably are aware, the old UK guidelines prescribed graded exercise therapy as a treatment for the condition. I'll mention more about that in a moment. How this is to look in practice: adults with ME-CFS, there's a separate section for children, but people with ME-CFS are supposed to get a personalized specialist team, or access to a specialist team, and that team will contain people with training and experience in ME-CFS, but look at the list of disciplines. So rheumatologists, rehabilitative practitioners, endocrinologists, infectious disease doctors, neurologists, and so on. This is the type of specialist team everybody with ME-CFS is expected to see upon receiving a diagnosis. The team might include physiotherapists and occupational therapists, and dare I say psychologists, but by absolutely no means must it include psychologists. So the idea that psychotherapy is the #1 treatment and therefore you must see a psychologist, it's gone. It's possible you might need to see a psychologist, or you might be recommended to see one, but of course we can all benefit from that from time to time, and diseases can be very distressing, and there may be an emotional need in there somewhere, but that is a supplement to the core treatment strategy, which is to focus on the medical or biomedical features. Let's just, I want to show you this. A person is supposed to then receive an assessment, a personalized assessment, a medical assessment, an assessment of physical functioning, an assessment of impact, current and past experiences with other medicines and medications, and so on. And these are sort of not standard, but they're commonly used assessment practices in many different illnesses. And then arising from the assessment, so you've got different stages. You've got a diagnosis, a specialist team evaluation, the assessment in detail, and then you get a treatment plan. What is, I suppose, not a treatment plan, that is slightly misleading, a personalized care and support plan. because treatment is a term that gets misinterpreted, and so they are, I think, are quite careful to avoid it. What does the plan involve? It involves personalized information for the patient. It involves personalized support for activities of daily living, mobility and daily living aids. And so, again, the emphasis is not on trying to cure the ME/CFS with cognitive behavior therapy. It's actually visiting the person in their home and making sure they have a good quality of life, providing them with the supports that they need, maybe for mobility, maybe for daily living and what have you. Likewise, for employment support and education. There's no reason why a person should not be supported to pursue their life goals, even if they have an illness like ME/CFS. And that is the focus. The focus is on achievement, on pursuing quality of life, and on maximizing well-being, not on trying to make the disease go away through some untested or unproven therapies. Self-management strategies, symptom management strategies, such as how to use your medications, all of this is intended to be personalized. Guidance on managing relapses and episodes, and details, contact details. It's a practical plan. So the focus of the treatment, quote unquote, approach, or the therapeutic approach, is on personalized care and on support based on a detailed assessment informed by a range of medical specialisms. Okay. So how does that then tally with the old guidelines? Well, the new guidelines are explicit in saying that currently we do not have something we can say cures ME/CFS. Now, that is not to say there aren't various curative technologies being investigated or various therapies being established and being evaluated, but we do not have something we can say is a cure for this condition that we can put into a guideline and say you must have. Therefore, and more of this, more of the detail in a moment, graded exercise therapy is no longer to be offered according to this new guideline. So it has gone from the number one or number two frontline therapy to a treatment that is no longer to be offered. And cognitive behavior therapy is more or less the same. It's not to be offered as a cure for ME/CFS. It is to be offered only as a psychological support, as you would offer CBT to people who have other debilitating or indeed terminal illnesses. Lots of psychologists work in healthcare settings, providing much needed emotional support to patients and indeed their families. And that is the only role CBT has in relation to ME/CFS according to this guideline. And this is explicitly stated in order to emphasize that the old guidelines' implicit claim that CBT cures you of ME/CFS is wrong. How does this look? It is very blunt. You might accuse me of over-summarizing, but have a look at the language. It says, do not offer people with ME/CFS any program that uses fixed increments, for example, graded exercise therapy. Now, you don't need to be, proficient in English language to be able to reduce that down to do not offer graded exercise therapy. Okay? It's not ambiguous. It's just an extended sentence. For cognitive behavior therapy, when you give cognitive behavior therapy to a patient, you are told to explain to the patient that this is not curative. So there was an anticipation that people might continue to offer CBT to patients and just say, well, we're following the guideline because we're offering emotional support. But the guideline now says that proper medical care for people with ME/CFS requires anyone giving CBT to explain that this CBT is not curative. And moreover, to explain that CBT is not based on a belief that people are making themselves sick through faulty cognitions. Okay, that was the old theory. So the new guideline is very clear on that. Let me keep moving on because there's a matter of some, I suppose, regional interest in a sense. The lightning process was put forward by various lobbying groups, a small number of lobbying groups really. The guideline covers the lightning process. It says do not offer the lightning process or therapies based on it, so you can't just change the name and offer it anyway. So do not offer the lightning process. And these recommendations are based on an evaluation of the empirical evidence into each of these therapies. Okay, so they as we will see in a moment, NICE were able to establish that the therapies were not evidence-based. Now, so this was quite a significant change in the guideline, and in a sense, it challenged a prevailing view. And I want to spend a moment or two referring back to that prevailing view. So in the UK, there had long been a belief that illnesses like ME-CFS were psychogenic. They were created by psychological forces. And it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that this is something that can be traced through the history of psychiatry and the history of medicine generally. And it has always been the case that certain patients, predominantly women, have been seen as prone to physical failure as a result of psychological stress. I won't go into all the details of this particular case study here today, but it is a significant landmark. There was a mass outbreak of myalgic encephalomyelitis in the Royal Free Hospital in London in the 1950s. The presenting physicians identified it as a neurological disorder, but two psychiatrists later decided to write a paper in the British Medical Journal saying that major epidemic back in the 1950s was actually caused by mass hysteria. And they evaluated all sorts of paperwork relating to the case, but they never visited the site, they never discussed it with the presenting physicians or any of the patients. And their argument was essentially that because most of the patients affected were women, that this is evidence, the red flag has been raised, this must be a hysterical illness. And that was, I mean, I can go into more detail, and I've done so in the past, and I will give you some links at the end. But that was the crux of the argument. It sounds almost comical, but you can actually string the statements together from the article, and that is precisely what they say. This led to the cognitive-behavioural model, because hysteria is an old-fashioned word, and people don't use that type of language in medicine these days. But we use the word psychogenic, and some people use the word cognitive-behavioural as a placeholder. The theory is grounded in this idea of dysfunctional assumptions. We heard some data earlier that directly challenged these types of claims. So the idea that people are making themselves sick, they're deconditioning themselves because they're thinking the wrong way about their symptoms and about their illness. And the theory is that a vicious cycle emerges. People get so down on themselves for being sick that they take to the bed, and then when they take to the bed, they don't get any exercise, and then they experience muscle wastage and weakness, and they don't eat properly, and then they experience fatigue and illness. And and then they just stay in the bed for longer. So that people who have this condition are trapping themselves in a vicious cycle through their dysfunctional cognition or their dysfunctional illness cognitions. There are many limitations to this type of theory. One is it's all based on self-report at the end of the day. It's all based on psychological factors. It makes draws all sorts of conclusions from negative tests. So the doctor sends away a blood test and it comes back negative, and then the doctor says, the absence of any information from this test proves that you have this diagnosis. So that is faulty logic in all sorts of ways. All the biological effects that we see in the human body in a person with ME-CFS that we've been hearing about over the course of today, all those effects cannot be explained with this idea that you made yourself sick by thinking that you were sicker than you actually were. Okay, I'm all for the idea of stress-related illness, but the types of pathways where stress leads to illness are often things like elevated blood pressure on a chronic basis, contributing to atherosclerosis or something, and cardiovascular disease. There's lots of science around that, but there's no science to say that faulty illness cognitions causes this kind of cellular degeneration and joint hypermobility that we see in many people with ME-CFS. And I want to break down this little pair of arguments. One is that if the psychogenic theory were true, if cognitive behavioral factors were causing the illness, then cognitive behavior therapies should be very good. Okay? But the research evidence shows that they're not. And secondly, if psychological factors were causing people to get ME/CFS, then if you turned back time and looked at people before they were sick, you should see that they were psychologically different to other people. Okay? And we can do that type of research without turning back time, but if you just do a prospective study, if you start with a large group of healthy people and follow them and identify the ones who become sick, but you use your preliminary data to see if they were psychologically different to everybody else. And that type of evidence also disproves the cognitive behavior theory. I'll show you some references and some variables, but ultimately the literature is clear that while people often self-report feeling better at the end of therapy, there is no empirical evidence to show that anything physical changes in patients with ME/CFS. Now, that is not to say people don't recover from the illness or improve, and that can happen with any illness. But there is nothing to link recovery to therapy. And cognitive behavior therapy and graded exercise therapy, for that matter, do not improve people's physical strength or their stamina or their mobility or their school attendance or their return to work. And one of the biggest trials ever conducted was the PACE trial, which you possibly have heard of. None of the patients that were allegedly cured in that trial ever returned to work. So they continue to get disability payments to this day. So the so-called cure is all based on I feel better. It's not based on actual physical markers of disease improvement. And likewise, with the other type of logic, when these researchers in Chicago followed a group of 4,500 people and identified the 5% who got an infection and identified the 12% of those who went on to get ME/CFS, they were able to show that those people were not psychologically different to the non-patients at the outset of the study. And all those 4,500 people were the same in terms of their anxiety levels, their depression levels, and various psychological measures that were taken at outset. So we don't see the prospective proof. In fact, what we do see is that immune irregularities at time 1 predict future illness, but psychological irregularities at time 1 do not. Okay, so that type of research is there, and it disproves the theory. So the paradigm, therefore, has shifted. The psychogenic theory is not evidence-based in any meaningful sense of the word. And I would say, and I don't want to be too provocative or argumentative, simply putting the word evidence-based into your sentence does not make it so, and does not make your claim true. And you will see many people writing letters to newspapers and so on saying, and blog posts on kind of non-peer-reviewed sites saying, oh, this is evidence-based, and NICE have rejected the evidence. Just because you say that doesn't make it so. And the paradigm in science has shifted a long time ago. And in many senses, NICE are simply catching up. They're following the science. And the UK, in a sense, are getting in line with everybody else. And it is maybe a cultural or a social science issue as to why the UK's guideline affects so many different countries' practices, but it is certainly helpful that this paradigm has shifted and that the UK's guideline now better resembles the prevailing medical science in, for example, the United States and other parts of the world. So the challenges now are, well, I just want to comment on one slide on how medical controversies unfold. Because the challenge is, as I said, just because you give people research evidence doesn't mean they change their minds. And we know this throughout science, and some of you might be interested or might be aware of this whole theory of scientific revolutions, the idea that science happens nicely and happily and everybody agrees, and then suddenly people discover that the research doesn't support their view. Then the paradigm shifts, and then we end up with the so-called new normal, and then the cycle moves again. And ultimately, the idea of shifting paradigms is not a simple matter of looking at the evidence and deciding what to think. It's about agreeing among scientists about how they feel about the evidence a lot of the time. And ultimately, scientific consensus is always temporary, but it's cumulative, and it's based on the best information available at the time. And here's something that I think is a very striking comparison. The NICE review from 2007 for the old guideline that people, 6 people in the UK are still banging on about the old guideline and saying that everything is evidence-based. The original guideline was based on 4 CBT studies and 5 graded exercise therapy studies. And on the basis of those combined 9 research findings, they said these are promising therapies and these are the therapies that should be used. Okay, they didn't discuss the study limitations, and that is worth mentioning because the same reviewers had published a paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association where they presented the same research findings but actually critiqued the research and said it was very poor. But by the time it reached the NICE guideline documents in 2007, a couple of years later, the problems with the research had seemingly evaporated, and all that was left in the summary was the research findings. And there were 9 of them. The 2020 review was based on 172 research findings relating to cognitive behavior therapy and 64 findings relating to graded exercise therapy. And all the studies were evaluated for quality and given a score. And all the research studies were scored as either low or very low quality. So not only was there mountains of research to look at, but there was also a quality score for each study that was being evaluated. So this was a much bigger and better evidence review than took place for the 2007 guideline. So it's kind of interesting when somebody writes a column in the British Medical Journal who doesn't like the new guideline and states something like, it's unclear how NICE arrived to a different conclusion. It's unclear how the evidence changed. But it's actually not unclear at all. There's 2,300 pages on the NICE website since November 2020 explaining exactly why the evidence has changed or why the new evidence has appeared and has overwhelmed the old evidence. Those 9 studies are no longer in play because we've got 230 new studies saying that they were wrong. Now, any sensible person would look at that and see that as a basis for changing one's mind. But not everybody is sensible, I suppose we might say. And often these types of customs and practice in therapy and in science are self-reinforcing. And lots of the studies are bad because they don't use proper blinding, because they measure only self-reported outcomes. So they ignore the physical data and focus on the questionnaire data. And there's kind of an echo chamber of peer review. So you often find that the people reviewing each other's research are actual friends and collaborators of each other in this particular field. And we had one paper published last year, David Tuller and I, where we evaluated a paper that had been published by some of these authors and pointed out it was in the journal, one of those journals where they named the reviewers. And we pointed out that one of the peer reviewers was actually the PhD student of one of the authors. Okay, so even if that wasn't a conflict of interest, how is the PhD student supposed to say this study is actually as bad as all the other studies? They're not going to say this. So there are serious problems with peer review, and it creates this so-called echo chamber. And that's one of the reasons why we should not be shocked to hear some scientists, or some medical scientists at least, saying that they don't like the new guidelines, and they don't believe them in a sense. To conclude, ultimately, we might ask ourselves then, how do we succeed in modernizing practice and research given these kind of psychological factors, these kind of behavioral barriers? So where do we go next? Well, this is going to be a detailed lecture on organizational change. You can do a master's degree on that if you wish, but I can summarize most of it in one PowerPoint bullet point. The principles of organizational change require us to consider how we cultivate a sense of need in our audience, how we recruit leaders and ambassadors for change, and how we institute reward systems to create change. So you can't simply launch a new guideline. You have to have a plan to implement the guideline and to secure knowledge of the guideline and buy-in for the guideline. We shouldn't remember the pragmatics of group-level attitude change. And Max Planck, the famous physicist, talked about change in science. And actually, this is to paraphrase him. He actually said one funeral at a time. But what he was speculating at here is that scientists as a community don't just change their minds. What happens is the old scientists retire and the new scientists study the new textbooks, and that's how scientific consensus shifts. And now, of course, there are individual scientists and medical practitioners who are very senior in their careers, who are very forward-looking and progressive. And likewise, there are some junior folks coming through the system who are very backwards in how they look at things. But the majority view is shifting in the right direction, and maybe it's happening one retirement at a time, but there is a lot of buy-in to this new guideline in the UK. And there's a sense in which, in psychology and psychological sciences, that anything that challenges bad research is a good thing. And that used to be seen as a point of sensitivity. Now it's welcomed. And so this is a very good case study of precisely that good thing that people are welcoming. We do need to understand that some clinicians are just going to be confused, because not everybody reads all the science and not everybody cares, frankly, for all the science. We know that lots of clinicians have spent their careers, essentially, since 2007. They've spent 15 years giving CBT because they thought that was the right thing to do. And now someone is telling them, you are actually doing the wrong thing for 15 years. Now, the human side of medical doctors and psychiatrists and so on comes into play. Not everybody is dogmatic about the theory, but they don't like the idea of being told that they were wrong all this time. They've been doing damage all this time. And so there's a natural skepticism or fear of the new guideline in that sense. And that's something we need to think about as professionals in how we secure change among our colleagues. It's definitely true that misinformation is a problem in science and in medical practice, the same as it is all over the world. And we need to face up to that as well. Some people are being told the wrong thing. And they're being told the wrong thing not in peer-reviewed articles necessarily, but in non-peer-reviewed sources. But not liking the rules isn't a basis for tearing up the rule book. And that's a matter of common sense as much as anything else. So the implementation of change needs to focus on just following the guidelines. Multidisciplinary teams, having a single point of contact for patients to refer people to the team, certain types of physiotherapy for certain cases, no graded exercise, however, and psychotherapy has its place as an emotional support. Just yesterday, and I think this is very promising, in my own country, and I managed to get this cut and paste into the slide presentation on time for today, there was an article in the Irish Times, which is the sort of intellectual newspaper. They had an extensive report on this, and it quoted the clinical director of the health service in Ireland, Dr. Ciara Martin, who's chairing a multidisciplinary group to institute new care guidelines, the first ever clinical guidelines for ME-CFS in Ireland. And she can be quoted there at the bottom. The new guidelines will establish ME as a biological illness. That has always been the concern of people with ME, that old-fashioned stigma that it was a psychological illness. So we see leaders of health services now responding to the new guideline emanating from England, which is an influential English-speaking country. And the practicalities are that service providers and service planners will now think differently because of that change. So the paradigm is certainly shifting, and the word is getting out there, and it's a hugely significant moment. In terms of certain countries, and all the countries here, and in my country as well, but many countries around the world. Here are some other bits and pieces you might like to consult that I wrote on the blog. A 10 questions and answers piece that might be of help in summarizing some of what I've just said, and an analysis of some of the denialism that pops its head up now and again while the paradigm shifts and while we follow the science. But ultimately, I can say with a degree of confidence that we are entering a new era here, and it's not coming soon enough for some people. Many people have had very poor experience of medical care as a result of official resistance to science. So it is all the more important that we follow the science and that we implement science-based guidelines when they are developed. So with that, I'll leave it there, and thank you very much for your time today.